The phone rang at a foster home in Aurora, Colorado. And whoever was holding that receiver on the other end, they already knew what they were going to say. It was the evening of November 18th, 2001. The kind of November evening that settles into your bones before you realize it's arrived. Colorado in late autumn holds a particular kind of cold. Not brutal yet. Not the kind that stops you from going outside, but the kind that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter and walk a little faster. The kind of cold that feels like a warning. Earlier that day, a 16-year-old boy had walked out of the front door of his foster home. Nobody chased him. Nobody caught him. He just walked. And then, hours later, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm. That's the detail that stays with you. Not frantic. Not crying. Not even angry in the way teenagers often are when they're running from something. The voice was calm, measured, and completely decided. I'm never coming back. 4 words. And then the line went quiet. That was the last confirmed contact anyone has ever had with Luis Acosta. A 16-year-old boy. 5 feet 4 inches tall. 105 pounds. Short black hair. Brown eyes. A slim build that made him look younger than he was. Or maybe just more vulnerable. More exposed. The kind of build that makes you wonder how a person survives alone in the world without someone to watch out for them. And that question, that very specific, very uncomfortable question, is one that investigators, advocates, and anyone who has ever stumbled across his name in a missing persons database has been sitting with ever since. For more than 24 years now, Luis Acosta has been listed as a missing person, classified as an endangered runaway, still carried on the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's database, still on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, still out there somewhere. Or not. We don't know which. That's the thing about this case. That's the thing that makes it different from so many of the stories we tell on this channel. Stories where the mystery is who did it, or how, or why. This case doesn't give you that. This case gives you 4 words and a disconnected line, and then nothing. No body. No confirmed sightings. No arrest. No resolution. No confirmed return to family. Nothing but a name on a list, and the faint and terrible possibility that somewhere in the world, maybe in the mountains of Central America, maybe on a street corner you've walked past 100 times, there's a man who is now 41 years old who once called a foster home in Aurora, Colorado, and said he was never coming back. And maybe he kept that promise. Or maybe someone made sure he did. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Because this story deserves to be heard. Luis Acosta deserves to be remembered. And the people who loved him, whoever they are, wherever they are, deserve answers. So let's start at the beginning. Not at the phone call. Not at the foster home. Let's start earlier, with what we know about who Luis Acosta was before the night he walked away. Because every missing person was a living, breathing, complicated human being before the world reduced them to a photograph and a case number. And if we're going to understand what happened to Luis, if we're going to have any hope of understanding it at all, we need to understand him. We know he was 16 years old when he disappeared. Born approximately in 1985, which means he would have come into the world in the middle of the Reagan administration, at a time when America's foster care system was already under enormous pressure, underfunded, overwhelmed, and struggling to keep pace with the number of children who needed it. By 2001, when Luis walked out of that foster home in Aurora, the system had not improved in any meaningful way. In fact, in many states, it had gotten worse. Aurora, Colorado in 2001 was a city in transition. The second largest city in the state, a suburb that had grown so large it had stopped feeling like one. Sprawling. Diverse. A city with real neighborhoods, real communities, real people trying to make lives for themselves, but also a city with the particular kind of anonymity that comes with rapid growth. The kind of place where a 16-year-old boy could walk out of a house and disappear into the fabric of the city without anyone around him knowing his name. That anonymity matters. Remember it. Luis was in foster care. That much is confirmed. We don't know the specific circumstances that brought him there. We don't know if his biological family was unable to care for him, if there had been neglect or abuse, if he had been in the system for years, or if this placement was more recent. What we know is that on the night of November 18, 2001, he was living in a foster home in Aurora, Colorado, and he made a decision to leave. Or someone made it for him. And that distinction, the one between choice and coercion, is the quiet center of this entire case. Here's what investigators and advocates who have looked at this case have noted. The phone call. That single, solitary phone call. Luis called back to the foster home after he had already left. He didn't call a friend. He didn't call a relative, or at least, not that we know of. He called back to the place he had just walked away from. And he told them, in 4 words, that he was done. Think about what that requires. You are 16 years old. You have walked away from the only official home you have. The night is getting colder. You are somewhere in Aurora. We don't know where. We don't know how far he had traveled from the house. We don't know if he was at a payphone, a friend's place, somewhere else entirely. We don't know if he was alone. We don't know if there was someone standing next to him when he made that call. What we do know is that he made it. And then he didn't call again. Now, here's the thing about teenage runaways that most people don't understand. Because the popular image of a runaway is a dramatic, impulsive flight. A door slammed in the middle of a fight. A teenager storming out with nothing but the clothes on their back, running blind into the night. That does happen. That is a real pattern. But it is not the only pattern. Researchers who study runaway behavior in the foster care context have noted something important. For children who have spent significant time in the system, running away can actually be a planned and deliberate act. Something they've thought about. Something they've prepared for. The foster care system generates, in many of its children, a kind of hyper-independence, a survival reflex that says, I cannot depend on the system to keep me safe, so I will depend on myself. For a teenager who has already experienced being removed from a family, already experienced the instability of placement after placement, already learned that adults and institutions do not always follow through on their promises, leaving is not just an impulse. It can be a strategy. Was that what Luis was doing? Was he strategic? Was the call a goodbye? A closed loop? The act of someone who had planned this, who had made arrangements, who knew exactly where he was going? Or was the call something else entirely? Because here is the thing you have to hold in your head at the same time. A person can be both determined and in danger. A person can make a confident phone call and still be walking into something they don't fully understand. The calm in his voice, if there was calm, doesn't tell us he was safe. The certainty in his words doesn't tell us he was free. For words, one phone call, and then 24 years of silence. There is one additional piece of information that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's records include about this case. One detail that transforms the story from a relatively straightforward, if heartbreaking, account of a foster teen running away into something that opens a door into a much larger, much more complicated set of questions. It is believed that Luis Acosta may now be residing in Honduras. Honduras. Not across the city. Not in another state. Another country. A country over 2,000 miles from Aurora, Colorado. A country with a dramatically different landscape. A different language as the dominant tongue in many regions. A country that in 2001 was dealing with its own enormous upheavals in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch, which had devastated the region just 3 years earlier and left hundreds of thousands of people displaced. How does a 16-year-old boy, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 105 pounds, placed in foster care in Colorado, end up, or come to be believed to be, in Honduras? That is the question that we need to sit with. And we will. Because the answer, whatever it is, tells us something profound about who Luis Acosta was, what his life in that foster home was actually like, what connections he had to the world outside of it, and whether the last thing he ever said to the people who were supposed to be watching over him was the truth. I'm never coming back. Was that a declaration of freedom? Or a warning no one knew how to read? We're going to spend the next hour finding out. And I'll tell you right now, we're not going to arrive at a neat answer. This case does not have one. What it has instead is a trail of details, a web of possibilities, and one overriding, unanswered, 24-year-old question at its center. Where is Luis Acosta? But before we get to the Honduras theory, before we get to the alternate possibilities, before we get to the silence that has followed this case for 2.5 decades, we need to understand the world Luis Acosta was living in. Not just the foster home. Not just Aurora. The world of a 16-year-old boy inside the American foster care system in 2001. Because that world matters more than almost anything else to understanding this case. And it is not a comfortable world to look at closely. There are things we know about Luis Acosta. And there are things we don't know. And the gap between those two categories is wider than it should be for a 16-year-old child who disappeared in the United States of America in the year 2001. We know his physical description with precision. 5 feet 4 inches tall, 105 pounds, slim build, short black hair, brown eyes, a face that would have made him look more like a child than a young man, not because of any particular feature, but because of that combination of slight build and youth. 105 pounds is not very much for a 16-year-old. It is the weight of someone still growing, still becoming, still figuring out what kind of person they are going to be. We know he was in foster care in Aurora, Colorado. We know the disappearance date, November 18th, 2001. We know the call happened. We know the words he said. And we know, and this is the detail that changes the entire geometry of the case, that investigators believe he may be in Honduras. What we do not know is almost everything else. We don't know his biological family's full story. We don't know how long he had been in the system. We don't know what this particular foster placement was like for him. Whether it was a placement where he felt safe, where he felt unseen, where he felt something entirely different. We don't know the name of the foster home. We don't know if he had siblings in care, either with him or placed elsewhere. We don't know if he had friends at school. We don't even know, with public certainty, which school he attended. And we don't know, perhaps most crucially of all, whether he had told anyone he was planning to leave. Whether there was a conversation, quiet, careful, over weeks or months, in which he worked through the possibility of walking away. Or whether November 18th arrived the way these things sometimes do, all at once, without warning, triggered by something small enough that no one around him recognized it as the final straw. What we can do, what we have to do, is build a portrait of his world. Not a fictional one, not an invented one, but one constructed from what we know about the reality of teenage life in foster care in America at the turn of the millennium. Because understanding that reality is understanding the context in which Luis Acosta's disappearance happened. And context, in a case this sparse on concrete details, is everything. The American foster care system in 2001 was under extraordinary strain. Nationally, at any given moment, approximately 550,000 children were in foster care. A significant percentage of them were teenagers. And teenagers in foster care occupy a uniquely difficult position in that system, because the system, by design and by culture, has always been better at supporting younger children. Infants and toddlers are adopted at high rates. School-aged children, with more time. But teenagers? Teenagers age out. They reach 18 and the system releases them, often abruptly, often without adequate preparation, into a world where they are expected to function as independent adults despite having spent formative years in a structure that made many of the decisions for them. But this is getting ahead of ourselves. For a teenager living inside that system in 2001, the daily reality had a texture to it. One of the most consistent things researchers and former foster youth describe about their experience is the feeling of impermanence. You are always, in some part of yourself, aware that this placement could end, that the family you're living with is not your family in the way that word means something final, that your room in this house is, technically, not your room, that the rules here are the rules here, not universal truths, but local arrangements that will change when your address changes. Some children in foster care find security within that impermanence. Some foster families are extraordinary. Some placements become permanent, become adoptions, become real. But for many children, particularly teenagers who have already experienced multiple placements, who have already developed what psychologists call an insecure attachment style as a result of early disruption, the system generates something else. A low-level, constant, thrumming awareness that the ground beneath you is not entirely solid. And for some of those teenagers, that awareness eventually makes a particular kind of logic click into place. If the ground is not solid, maybe I should find my own ground. If I am going to end up alone, maybe I should be alone on my own terms. Running away, in that context, is not irrational. It is adaptive. It is a teenager's system of self-protection operating in the only way it knows how. Now, we cannot say with certainty that this is what Luis was experiencing. We cannot say with certainty what his specific foster placement was like. We cannot say whether he had been in the system for 2 months or 6 years by the time November 2001 arrived. We cannot say whether the foster home in Aurora was a place of warmth or coldness, engagement or indifference. But we can say this. He left. And more than that, he called back to tell them he wasn't returning. That call, that specific act of communication, is one of the most important and under-examined elements of this entire case. Think about it. Most runaways don't call. They leave, and the leaving is the message. But Luis called. He picked up a phone, at some point, from some location, and he dialed back to the place he had just walked away from. And he said, "I'm not coming back. I am telling you this. I want you to know it." That is not impulsive behavior. Impulsive behavior runs and does not look back. This behavior runs, stops, makes a conscious decision to communicate, and delivers a specific message. It is deliberate. It is intentional. It has the quality of someone closing a chapter, not burning a house down. Which brings us to a question that researchers and advocates who have examined this case keep returning to. Who was Luis Acosta, fundamentally? Was he a quiet kid? An angry one? Was he someone who kept his plans close to his chest? Or someone who had been telling people for months that he intended to leave? We don't have enough confirmed information to answer those questions with certainty. But the structure of what happened, the walk, the call, the 4 words, suggests a person who was, at minimum, capable of planning. Capable of deciding and then executing on that decision. A person who had thought through the exit, even if we can't be certain he had thought through what came after. And now we arrive at the detail that reshapes everything. Honduras. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's records on this case state that Luis may be residing in Honduras. This is not a certainty. The word may is doing a lot of work in that sentence. But it is included as part of his missing persons documentation. Which means investigators, at some point, had reason to believe that Honduras was a credible location. That someone had provided information, however incomplete, however secondhand, that pointed in that direction. Honduras sits at the heart of Central America. In 2001, it was one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, still recovering from Hurricane Mitch's 1998 devastation. But it was also a country with a large diaspora. A significant Honduran population had established itself in the United States throughout the 1980s and 1990s, concentrated in cities like New York, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, and yes, scattered through cities across the American Southwest and Mountain West. Colorado had a Honduran community. Aurora had a Hispanic community. Latino families from across Central and South America who had built lives there, established churches, social networks, community ties that cross state lines and national borders. If Luis Acosta had Honduran family roots, and the inclusion of Honduras in his case file strongly suggests this possibility, then the community infrastructure existed in 2001 to support a teenager who wanted to make contact with relatives in another country, to make arrangements, to find a way. But this raises a question so important that we need to sit with it for a moment before moving forward. How does a 16-year-old boy, 105 pounds, no independent income, no car, in foster care, travel from Aurora, Colorado to Honduras in 2001? Because this is not a simple thing to do. In 2001, international travel for a minor required documentation. A passport, adult assistance at border crossings, money for travel, a plan, a contact on the other end. None of those things are impossible, but none of them are things a 16-year-old acquires overnight. Which means one of two things. Either Luis had been planning this for longer than anyone around him knew. He had, quietly and carefully, been assembling the pieces of an exit strategy that would take him not just out of the foster home, not just out of Aurora, but out of the country entirely. Or, someone helped him. Someone who knew him, who had access to him, who had the resources and the knowledge and the connections to make international travel possible for a 16-year-old in state care. Someone helped him leave. And that is where this case stops being just a sad story about a teenager running away from an unstable situation. That is where it becomes something more complicated, something with more layers, something that requires you to ask, who, in Luis Acosta's world, had the means and the motive to help a minor disappear? And were they helping him, or using him? Because there is a version of this story in which Luis Acosta, armed with information and determination and the particular kind of resilience that the foster care system sometimes forges in the people who survive it, made it to Honduras, found family, built a life, became a man in a place where no one knew to look for him, and maybe, in some quiet part of himself, that was exactly what he wanted. There is that version. And then there is the other one. The one where someone saw a 16-year-old boy, alone, small, in foster care, with limited official support network, and recognized an opportunity. The one where the help he received was not freely given but strategically extended. The one where the voice on the other end of the phone call was calm because someone told him exactly what to say. The one where, "I'm never coming back," was a script, not a declaration. Both versions are possible. We don't know which one is true, but we're going to look at both. We're going to look at them carefully and honestly, and without flinching. Because Luis Acosta was a real person. He is still, technically, a missing person. And the story of how he vanished, wherever that story ultimately leads, deserves to be told with the seriousness it has never quite received. The silence after that phone call lasted more than 24 years. It's time to break it. Let's go back to November 18th, 2001. Not to the phone call. Before it. To the hours before the call. Because the moment Luis Acosta walked out of that foster home is the moment the clock started, and the clock has never stopped. It has been running in the background of his case for more than 2 decades, ticking without pause, while the world moved on and Luis Acosta remained exactly where he was. 17 words into a cold case file. Classified as an endangered runaway, last known to be somewhere between Aurora, Colorado, and the Republic of Honduras. November in Colorado. You need to understand the setting to understand the story. Aurora is not a small town. It is not the kind of place where a missing teenager immediately generates community-wide alarm, not the way it might in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone's name. Aurora is a city of 300,000 people. It is a city of neighborhoods stacked against neighborhoods, where the house 2 doors down might as well be a world away if you don't happen to share a fence line with it. It is a city where anonymity is achievable, where a teenage boy, walking down a sidewalk in the early dark of a November evening, is invisible in the way that teenagers so often are, present, but not seen. There but not noticed. He walked out. We don't know the exact time. We don't know precisely what he was wearing. We don't know if he took anything with him, a bag, clothes, money, identification. We don't know if he said anything to anyone in the house before he left, or if he simply went. We don't know if there was a trigger, an argument, a moment, something that finally tipped the balance, or if November 18th was just the day the plan was ready. The day all the pieces had been set, and all he had to do was stand up and go. What we know is that he went. And here's the thing about a walk like that. For most of us, walking away from a house is nothing. We do it dozens of times a day. We step outside, we get in our cars, we run errands, we come back. But for a teenager in foster care, a teenager who is legally in the custody of the state, whose physical location is a matter of official record, who is required to be in a specific place at a specific time, walking out of a house takes on a different weight. It is not just leaving. It is severing. It is taking the thread that connects you to the official world and cutting it with both hands. Luis cut that thread. And then, hours later, we don't know how many hours, he picked up a phone. Now, here is what we need to think about carefully. That phone call was not made from the foster home. He had already left. He was somewhere else, which means he had been moving, had been somewhere, for some period of time before he made that call. Where was he? A friend's house? A payphone on a corner somewhere? The home of a relative, biological or otherwise, who was giving him shelter, giving him access to a telephone? We don't know the answer to any of those questions. That information, if it was ever gathered, is not part of the public record in any form we can access. But the question itself matters enormously, because the location of that call is the last thread connecting Luis Acosta to the known world. If he was at a friend's house, it tells us something about his social network. If he was at a payphone, it tells us something about his planning, because he would have needed coins, would have needed to know the number by heart or have it written down. If he was at the home of a relative or a community member connected to family in Honduras, it tells us something far more specific about the infrastructure behind his departure. Someone received that call. Someone at the foster home picked up the phone and heard his voice, heard him say those 4 words. And then that person, or those people, had to make a decision about what to do next. Did they immediately contact authorities? Did they wait, hoping he'd come back on his own? How quickly did a missing persons report get filed? The precise timeline of the official response is not fully documented in the public-facing case materials. What is documented is that eventually, at some point after the call, after the realization that he was not returning, The appropriate agencies were notified. His case was opened. He was classified as an endangered runaway. His name went into the system. And that is where it has sat, largely undisturbed, for over 2 decades. Now, endangered runaway is an important classification. It is not the same as missing under suspicious circumstances. It is not the same as a case where investigators immediately believe foul play is involved. An endangered runaway classification says, this person has left voluntarily, or appears to have, but they are in a situation that makes them particularly vulnerable. In the case of a minor, particularly a minor in state care, the endangerment is almost automatic. A 16-year-old alone on the streets has no legal way to work, no legal way to sign a lease, no official safety net. They are, by definition, at risk. But here is where the classification can also become a problem. Because endangered runaway, in 2001, in the national landscape of missing persons attention, was not the same as an abducted child. It was not the same as a case that generated immediate, intensive, sustained investigation. Runaway cases, particularly those involving teenagers in the foster care system, were historically under-investigated. Not because investigators didn't care, but because the sheer volume was overwhelming, because resources were limited, and because the system had a tendency to assume that teenagers who ran away eventually came back or eventually surfaced somewhere. The statistics supported this, to a degree. Many did come back. Many did surface. But not all. And the ones who didn't, the ones who vanished completely, the ones who ended up in situations far more dangerous than anyone imagined when they watched them walk out the door, those cases often got lost in the volume. They got filed. They got periodically reviewed. They sat. Luis Acosta's case sat. And as it sat, the world changed around it. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, just weeks before his disappearance, had shifted the entire focus of American law enforcement and national attention in profound ways. International borders, which had already been under scrutiny, became dramatically more complex to navigate in the months following that November. And yet, somehow, the Honduras theory exists. Somehow, the information came, to investigators, at some point, that he may have crossed a border, may have made it out of the United States entirely. How? We need to be honest about what we don't know here. We don't know who provided the Honduras lead. We don't know when it was provided, whether it came in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance or years later. We don't know how reliable the source was or how thoroughly it was investigated. The public record does not give us those details. What it gives us is the phrase, maybe residing in Honduras. That phrase is worth everything. Because residing is a specific word. Not passed through. Not was seen traveling toward. Not may have had contact with individuals from. Residing. As in, living there. As in, having established some kind of life there. If that is accurate, even as a possibility, then we are not looking at a tragedy of a teenager who vanished into danger and was never seen again. We are looking at something more extraordinary and, in its own complicated way, more hopeful. A teenager who somehow, with some combination of determination and help and resources we can only speculate about, made it to another country and began again. But more hopeful is not the same as resolved. It is not the same as safe. And it is not the same as okay. Because even if Luis Acosta is alive in Honduras, even if he is 41 years old right now, even if he has a name and a life, and people who know him there, he is still listed as a missing person in the United States. His case is still open. And that means that there are systems, databases, records, an entire infrastructure of official concern that is still holding his name, still waiting. And there is one question underneath all of this that nobody seems to have definitively answered. Does Luis Acosta know he's still missing? Does he know that in Aurora, Colorado, in a file cabinet or a database server, his name is still attached to that classification, endangered runaway, still attached to that November night, still connected to that phone call he made when he was 16 years old, and the world seemed to have given him very few choices, and he chose to make his own? Does he know that somewhere, someone is still looking? Or does he think, as he may have always thought from the moment he put that receiver down, that it was finished? That he closed it? That he walked away clean? We don't know. But here's what we do know. The last confirmed moment of Luis Acosta's presence in the documented world was that phone call. A voice. For words. And a silence that has lasted longer than anyone should have to wait for an answer. Something happened after that call. Something we still don't fully understand. And the deeper we go into this case, the more we look at the timeline, the foster care context, the Honduras theory, the alternate possibilities, the more that phone call begins to feel not like an ending, but like the beginning of a story we've barely started to read. The next chapter of that story starts with a question that might be uncomfortable to sit with. Did Luis Acosta leave that foster home alone? Because if he didn't, if someone was with him, or waiting for him, or had arranged the whole thing, then everything we think we know about this case might need to be reconsidered from the very beginning. Let's talk about what the research actually says. Because one of the most important things you can do when you're looking at a case like this, a case that is quiet, a case with almost no official investigation noise around it, a case that exists mostly as a name on a list, is to understand the world the missing person was living in. Not in a clinical, detached way. In a real way. In the way that makes you feel the texture of a life that has largely been rendered invisible by the very systems that were supposed to protect it. By 2001, researchers who studied the foster care system had documented something deeply troubling. Teenagers in foster care ran away at an extraordinary rate. A significant percentage of children who ran away and ended up in serious danger, trafficking, exploitation, abuse, homelessness, had a history of foster care involvement. The pipeline between foster care and vulnerability was not accidental. It was structural. Here's how it worked. A child enters foster care, typically after some form of disruption to their biological family, neglect, abuse, parental incapacity, or a combination of factors. The child is placed in a foster home. Sometimes this placement is warm, stable, and genuinely supportive. Often it is not. Often the child moves. Often the child moves again. And with each move, something happens to that child's internal model of the world. The message that gets reinforced, placement after placement, is this: relationships are temporary. Adults cannot always be trusted to stay. The ground beneath you shifts. Teenagers who have internalized this message behave in ways that reflect it. They push boundaries. They test attachments. They sometimes sabotage stability because stability, to a brain trained by repeated loss, feels unfamiliar and therefore dangerous. They run. But here's the part of the story that rarely gets told. Not all runaways are running blindly. For some teenagers, particularly those who have been in the system long enough to develop a sophisticated understanding of its limitations, running is a deliberate and considered act. They have calculated that the risk of staying is greater than the risk of leaving. They have made contact with people outside the system, sometimes biological family, sometimes community members, sometimes individuals whose intentions are not what they present them to be. They have assembled resources. They have made a plan. The call Luis made, 4 words, calm delivery, is consistent with this pattern. Not the impulsive runaway who leaves in the heat of an argument and shows up at a relative's house 3 days later. The call is consistent with someone who had already thought through the next step. Someone who knew where they were going when they walked out the door. But knowing where you're going and being safe once you arrive are two entirely different things. Let's think about Luis's physical reality for a moment. 5 feet 4 inches. 105 pounds. That is a small person. A person who, walking alone at night in a large city, is physically vulnerable in ways that a larger teenager might not be. A person who could be overwhelmed. A person who, if they ended up in a dangerous situation, might not be able to physically remove themselves from it. That physical vulnerability matters in the context of what researchers were documenting about teenage runaways in 2001. The statistics were grim. Studies from that period found that a significant percentage of teenage runaways experienced physical or sexual assault within the first 48 hours of being on the streets. The risk was not hypothetical, it was immediate. Predatory individuals, both organized and opportunistic, were known to target runaway teenagers specifically. Foster care children, who often lacked the family safety net that could quickly get them off the streets, were particularly vulnerable. The exploitation pipeline, what researchers were beginning to call domestic minor sex trafficking, was, in 2001, almost entirely invisible as a policy concern. The language didn't exist yet in public conversation. The legal framework for addressing it was almost non-existent. And so what was happening to thousands of teenagers who ran from the foster care system and ended up in the hands of individuals who exploited them? It was happening in the shadows, without recognition, without response. We are not saying this happened to Luis Acosta. We are absolutely not making that claim. The Honduras theory, if there is any substance to it at all, suggests a different trajectory. And we're going to examine that trajectory carefully and honestly in the next section. But we need to name the shadow. We need to sit with the knowledge that it existed. Because the Honduras possibility, however hopeful it might be if true, sits alongside a set of other possibilities that are not hopeful at all. And a full accounting of this case requires us to look at all of them. Let's talk about who helped Luis Acosta. Because almost certainly, someone did. A 16-year-old minor in foster care, with a physical build that made him look younger than his age, does not typically travel from Aurora, Colorado to Honduras, if indeed he did, without assistance. International travel in 2001, even for adults, was not a casual enterprise. Border crossings required documentation. Plane tickets required money. Land routes through Mexico required knowledge of specific pathways, specific contacts, specific resources that a teenager in foster care in Colorado would not have acquired through conventional means. So who had those resources? There are a few categories to consider. The first is biological family. If Luis had relatives, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, who had Honduran roots and who were living in the United States in 2001, they could have provided assistance. They could have funded travel, arranged contacts, facilitated movement across borders. The foster care system, it should be noted, does not always sever contact between children and their biological families. Sometimes contact continues, officially or otherwise. Sometimes biological relatives maintain relationships with children in care, relationships that the official record doesn't fully capture. If a biological relative reached out to Luis, or if Luis, over months or years, had maintained contact with family he wasn't supposed to be in contact with, then the picture becomes much clearer. The call becomes the goodbye to the foster system, not the goodbye to everyone. The walk out the door becomes a walk towards something, not just away from it. The second category is community network. Aurora's Hispanic community in 2001 was, like many immigrant communities, built on dense networks of mutual support. Community members helped each other navigate systems, find work, find housing, send money across borders. Within that network, if Luis was connected to it through family ties, acquaintances, or community organizations, there would have been individuals with the knowledge and means to facilitate what might look, from the outside, like a miraculous disappearance. From the inside of that community, it might have been something far more organized and intentional. The third category is the one we don't want to name, but have to. The third category is individuals whose interest in a 16-year-old boy with no strong official support network, no family immediately positioned to advocate loudly for him, classified in a system that would not generate intensive resources to find him. Individuals whose interest in such a boy was predatory. We have to consider this. We have to hold it. Because one of the things that makes this case so difficult is that the same logistics, the assistance, the resources, the knowledge of how to move someone from one place to another without official detection, can exist in the context of family reunification and in the context of exploitation. The surface of the story can look similar. The phone call, the 4 words, the departure, these things are not inconsistent with either possibility. What changes the interpretation entirely is who was waiting on the other side. If family was waiting, if a grandmother in a village outside Tegucigalpa had been on the phone with someone in Colorado for months, arranging for her grandson to come home, to come back to a place that was more his than any foster home had ever been, then the call is heartbreaking in a specific way. It is the ending of a chapter that was always going to end, an institution releasing its hold on a child who was never fully its to hold. If someone else was waiting, someone who had identified Luis as a target, who had offered him the thing he needed most, connection, belonging, the promise of a future, in exchange for something Luis might not have fully understood he was giving, then the call is something else. Something darker. A script delivered on cue, the last voluntary act in a story that was about to stop being his to tell. We don't know. And that not knowing is the thing that has to keep this case alive. That is the thing that has to make us uncomfortable enough to keep asking. There is something else worth noting here. Something that speaks to a pattern in cases involving foster youth who disappear and are believed to have gone to other countries. In the Utah State Missing Persons Database, a parallel resource to Colorado's, There is a documented case of a juvenile in state custody who ran away and whose family lived in Honduras. The records note the belief that he may have traveled there. The pattern is not unique. Children in foster care with family ties to Central America have, in multiple documented cases, made their way back to those family connections, sometimes with help, sometimes alone, sometimes through channels that were not entirely legal but were, in the end, oriented toward family. Luis Acosta's case fits that pattern. It does not confirm it. It fits it. And the fact that it fits a recognizable pattern, the fact that investigators had enough information to add, maybe residing in Honduras, to his official file, suggests that this theory was not simply speculation. Someone, at some point, said something that made investigators think Honduras was real. What they knew. What was said. Who said it? We don't have those answers. But we're getting closer to the questions we need to be asking. Because the Honduras theory is only the beginning of where this case leads when you look at it hard enough. And what comes next, the part where we actually examine whether this was truly voluntary, whether it was planned, and whether someone in Luis Acosta's world had reasons to help him disappear, that part changes everything. Honduras. Say the word slowly. Let it settle. Because it is not a casual destination. It is not the kind of place a 16-year-old boy from Aurora, Colorado ends up by accident. And it is not, if we're being specific and careful and honest, the kind of place that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation would include in a missing persons file, without some reason to believe it was real. So let's spend some time with this. Honduras in 2001 was a country in the long process of rebuilding. Hurricane Mitch had struck in October of 1998, 3 years before Luis walked out of that foster home, and Mitch was not an ordinary storm. It was one of the most destructive hurricanes in recorded history, killing approximately 11,000 people in Honduras alone, leaving another 1.5 million homeless, destroying a significant portion of the country's infrastructure and agricultural base. The International Monetary Fund estimated that Mitch set Honduras's development back by 50 years. By 2001, the physical rebuilding was ongoing. Infrastructure was being repaired. Communities were being slowly reconstructed. But the deeper effects, the displacement, the migration, the economic desperation that sent thousands of Hondurans northward in the years following the storm, those effects were still very much present. And those migration patterns matter to this story, because the Honduran community in the United States grew significantly in the years following Mitch. By 2001, there were established Honduran communities in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Houston, and in cities across the Mountain West, including in Colorado. Aurora's demographics in 2001 reflected significant Latino diversity, including Central American families from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. These were tight, interconnected communities, many of them maintaining active ties back to their home countries, sending remittances, communicating by phone, sometimes making trips back and forth. The corridor between a city like Aurora and communities in Honduras was not as insurmountable as it might sound to someone who has never had reason to navigate it. It was a corridor that families traveled, that money traveled, that information traveled. It was a corridor that, with the right connections and the right knowledge, a determined teenager could potentially travel to. Now let's think about the logistics seriously. In 2001, how could a 16-year-old travel from Colorado to Honduras? The most direct route would have been by plane, a flight from Denver International Airport, possibly with a connection in Miami, Houston, or Dallas, to Tegucigalpa's Toncontin International Airport, or to San Pedro Sula. A one-way ticket would have cost somewhere in the range of $300 to $500 at 2001 prices, depending on timing and routing. For a 16-year-old in foster care to board that flight, several things would have been needed: a passport, or a travel document. In 2001, children born in the United States of Honduran parents would have been eligible for both U.S. and Honduran passports. If Luis had dual citizenship, something entirely possible if his biological parents were Honduran nationals who came to the U.S., he might have had documentation that made the travel logistically possible. Even without a U.S. passport, a Honduran passport for a Honduran national minor could have been arranged through the Honduran consulate in Houston or Washington, D.C., with the appropriate documentation, adult accompaniment, or a solo travel authorization. Airlines in 2001 had policies around unaccompanied minors, though these were less stringent in some contexts than they would become in later years. An adult accompanying a minor, or documentation authorizing solo travel, would have been required. If an adult, a family member, a community member, was traveling with Luis, this hurdle essentially disappears. Money, the plane ticket, transportation to and from the airport, potentially lodging if there were layovers. This is real money. Not impossible for a community to assemble if they were motivated to do so, but not trivial either. All of this points to the same conclusion. If Luis made it to Honduras by plane, he almost certainly had adult help. Someone knew. Someone assisted. Someone funded the journey, provided the documentation, made it work. But there's another possibility worth considering, and one that requires acknowledging a harder truth about the Central America corridor in 2001. Land routes. From Colorado, a person determined to reach Central America could travel south through New Mexico and into Texas, cross into Mexico at any number of official or unofficial points, and then make their way through Mexico and into Guatemala and Honduras by land. This was a route traveled, in 2001, as it had been for decades before, by migrants moving in both directions. It was a route that often involved networks of individuals, drivers, guides, people who knew which roads to take and which officials to avoid. It was also a route that, particularly for unaccompanied minors, was dangerous in specific and serious ways. Human smuggling networks operated along this corridor. They still do. In 2001, they were well established, connected to broader criminal enterprises, and not discriminating about who they moved: families, individuals, teenagers. If someone with connections to these networks offered Luis a way south, he might have been given a version of the truth about what the journey would entail. Or he might not have been given the truth at all. This is the darkest version of the Honduras theory. Not that Luis arrived safely and began a new life, but that he was moved through a network that his family or community members believed was facilitating family reunification, while in reality the network's interests were more complex and more exploitative than anyone realized. We are speculating here. We need to be clear about that. There is no documented evidence that Luis Acosta was trafficked. There is no documented evidence of foul play at all. What there is a classification of endangered on a missing persons file and a single line stating he may be in Honduras. But speculation, when it is clearly labeled and grounded in documented patterns, is not irresponsible. It is necessary. Because the alternative, accepting endangered runaway, may be in Honduras at face value and moving on, is exactly how cases like this stay cold. So let's consider what a best-case Honduras scenario actually looks like. Best case. Luis had biological relatives in Honduras, parents, grandparents, aunts or uncles, who were living there and with whom he had maintained contact, officially or unofficially, while in foster care. The foster care system, for all its protocols, is not always successful at preventing contact between children and biological family. Phone calls happen. Letters happen. Information travels. If Luis had been communicating with family in Honduras throughout his time in foster care, then his departure becomes a very different story. It becomes a teenager who had a destination in mind, a family who was waiting for him, a community that spoke his language in every sense of the word, and who made the decision, at 16, to go to them rather than age out of the American system into a void. If this is true, Luis Acosta may have spent the last 24 years building a life in Honduras. He would now be 41 years old. He might have a family of his own. He might be living in a city or a village that has no idea an American missing persons database carries his name. He might have a name there that is different from the one on the file, not because he changed it to hide, but because he is going by his family's name, the name of people who claimed him in a way the American system never fully did. That version of this story is not tragic. It is complicated. It involves a system that failed to give a teenager the connections and the stability he needed within the United States. It involves a departure that was likely not entirely legal, at least not in terms of the custody obligations that existed around Luis. But it is not a story of harm. It is a story of a young person who found his way to where he felt he belonged. And if it's true, if he is there, alive, living a life, then there's one more thing we need to acknowledge. No one from the official world has been able to confirm it. In 24 years, with his name on national databases, With modern tools including age progression technology that can approximate what a person might look like at 41 based on what they looked like at 16, no one has been able to close this case. No one has been able to say, "We found him. He's okay. He's there." No confirmed sighting. No confirmation from Honduran authorities. No family member, so far as we know from the public record, who has come forward to say, "He arrived. He's safe. You can close the file." That silence around the Honduras theory is almost as loud as the original silence after the call. And it takes us directly into the territory we've been building towards since the beginning. The territory where we ask, what if Honduras was a deliberate misdirection? What if he may be in Honduras? Is the story someone told investigators to close down the investigation? What if the real story is more complicated than a teenager finding his way home? What if the phone call, those 4 words, was the last moment Luis Acosta had any real control over his own story? We don't want that to be true, but we need to consider it. And the only way to consider it honestly is to look at the full range of what could have happened to a 16-year-old boy in that specific position, in that specific moment, with that specific vulnerability, and to not look away from any of it. There are 4 possibilities sitting at the center of this case. Not 2. Not a simple binary between he made it and he's fine, and something terrible happened. 4 distinct possibilities, each with its own internal logic, each drawing from the confirmed facts and the documented patterns in ways that make it impossible to simply dismiss any of them. We're going to examine all 4, carefully and honestly. The first possibility, Luis Acosta planned his departure, executed it successfully, made it to Honduras, whether by air, land, or some combination of both, and has been living there ever since. Under this possibility, he is now 41 years old. He made the call as a genuine goodbye. He was, at that moment, already moving towards something. Family, community, a version of belonging that the American foster care system had been unable to give him. He reached his destination. He built a life. He may or may not know he's still listed as missing. He may have chosen, for reasons of his own, not to contact official systems to close the case. Perhaps he distrusts those systems, the same systems, after all, that were responsible for his welfare as a child. Perhaps he sees the open case as irrelevant to the life he's living now. Perhaps he simply doesn't know. Under this possibility, the most important thing is that he is alive. And the second most important thing is that the system that was supposed to protect him ultimately drove him away from the country that was his legal home. The second possibility, Luis was assisted in his departure by a well-intentioned network, family members, community connections, people who genuinely wanted to reunite him with his roots. But the network operated in ways that were not entirely legal and not entirely transparent. Perhaps the travel arrangements involved individuals who also moved people for other, less benign purposes. Perhaps Luis arrived in Honduras, but his journey there involved exposure to individuals and situations that were not what anyone intended. Perhaps the reunion with family was real and genuine, but the cost of getting there, the people he was moved through, the situations he was exposed to en route, left marks that no one can see from a database entry in Colorado. This version is complicated because it holds multiple truths at once. Genuine care and genuine harm are not mutually exclusive. People who love you can still put you in danger, especially when they're trying to navigate systems they don't fully understand and using resources that come with strings attached. A community trying to bring one of its children home, using the only networks available to it, might have done something that was partly beautiful and partly dangerous without ever meaning for it to be either. The third possibility is the one that requires the most care, but also the most attention. Luis was targeted. In 2001, the infrastructure for what we now understand as the domestic trafficking of minors was present in Aurora, in Colorado, in the Mountain West. It was present and it was largely invisible, not because it was hidden perfectly, but because the systems designed to recognize and respond to it did not yet have the language or the protocols to do so. The word grooming was not widely used in public conversation. The concept of a trafficker presenting themselves as a friend, a romantic partner, a community member, an opportunity, and using that relationship to move a vulnerable teenager into a situation of exploitation was understood by specialists, but not by the general public and not, in many cases, by the children being targeted. A 16-year-old boy in foster care, with limited official support, with the documented vulnerability that comes from that instability, with the particular kind of longing for belonging that the system tends to produce in the children who cycle through it, is, tragically, an attractive target. Not in a way that the system would immediately recognize. Not in a way that leaves obvious marks on the official record. Under this possibility, someone identified Luis before he walked out of that foster home. Someone built a relationship with him, over days, weeks, possibly months. Offered him something. Maybe it was the promise of family. Maybe it was money. Maybe it was a vision of a life somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere that made more sense than a foster home in Aurora. And Luis, who was 16 and small, and had been told in 100 quiet ways by the system around him that he was temporary, that he was replaceable, that he did not have the same claim on permanence that other children did, Luis accepted the offer. The phone call, under this possibility, is not a declaration of independence. It is a performance. The words, 4 of them, calm, decided, are words someone coached him to say. The calm is not his. Or the calm is his, because he believes the story he's been told. He believes he's going somewhere better. He doesn't yet know what he's walking into. And the silence afterward, the 24 years of it, is explained not by a new life built successfully, but by a life that was not his to live on his terms. We have no evidence to confirm this possibility. Let us be absolutely clear about that. There is no documented information that trafficking was involved in Luis's disappearance. But there is documented, research-backed knowledge that children in his position were targeted in this way, in that era, in that geographic region. The pattern is real. The possibility must be named. The fourth possibility is perhaps the most haunting to sit with, precisely because it is the least dramatic. Luis walked away, made the call, and then, despite his intentions, despite his plans, something went wrong. Not trafficking. Not a targeted operation. Just the brutal ordinary arithmetic of vulnerability. A teenager alone in the cold, with limited resources, in a world that does not protect people who have no one officially watching out for them. An accident. An illness. A situation that escalated in a way no one planned. A night that turned into a week that turned into a month, and somewhere in that time, before any of the larger plans he may have had could be executed, something happened. And no one reported it. No one connected it. No one knew to look. Under this possibility, Luis never made it to Honduras. The Honduras lead is real. Someone who knew him provided that information in good faith, based on conversations they'd had with him, plans he'd shared. But it is the plan, not the outcome. It is what he intended, not what he achieved. Under this possibility, his remains may be somewhere. Unidentified. Unconnected to his name. There are thousands of unidentified remains in the United States. NamUs carries both the missing persons records and the unidentified remains records for exactly this reason. To try to build bridges between the nameless and the named. There is no confirmed match between Luis Acosta and any unidentified remains. That is meaningful. It is not conclusive. Now, which of these 4 possibilities is true? We don't know. What we can do is assess them against what we know about Luis's specific situation, the confirmed details of his case, and the documented patterns in similar cases. The Honduras theory, supported by its inclusion in the official case file, remains the most concrete lead. Someone told investigators something that made them believe it was credible. In the absence of contradicting information, it deserves to be taken seriously. The planned escape interpretation is consistent with the behavior documented. The walk, the call, the deliberate goodbye. It aligns with what researchers know about calculated departures by teenagers who have been in the system long enough to develop survival strategies. The third and fourth possibilities, exploitation and accident, are not supported by any specific evidence in this case. But they are supported by the broader documented reality of what happens to teenage runaways in the foster care system, and they cannot be responsibly dismissed. What all 4 possibilities share is a common foundation. Luis Acosta was a 16-year-old boy who the American foster care system was unable to hold. Whatever happened after he walked out that door, freedom, reunion, exploitation, tragedy, it happened because he chose, or was compelled, to leave a system that was supposed to protect him, but that he clearly felt, in some fundamental way, had failed him. That failure is not abstract. It is not a bureaucratic inadequacy. It is the lived experience of a child who called back to a foster home and said he wasn't returning, who had decided, at 16, that the world outside was better than the world inside, even knowing what the world outside could look like. That decision, that calculus, that moment, it tells us everything about what it meant to be Luis Acosta on November 18, 2001. And it tells us everything about what we owe him now. We owe him the honest examination of every possibility. We owe him the refusal to simplify his story into a comfortable narrative. We owe him the discomfort of sitting with what we don't know, for as long as it takes to find out. Because the silence that has surrounded this case for more than 2 decades is not neutral. Silence, in a missing persons case, is a position. It is a choice, sometimes the system's choice, sometimes the family's, sometimes the individual's own. And understanding why the silence has lasted this long is as important as understanding what happened on the night it began. And there is one thing about the silence in this case that we haven't fully reckoned with yet. It is not just the silence of authorities who couldn't find him. It might be the silence of a person who chose not to be found. What does that choice say about the world he left behind? No body has been found. Let that sit for a moment. In a case that has been open for more than 24 years, a case involving a minor, a case classified as endangered, there is no physical evidence that Luis Acosta came to a violent end. No remains have been identified as his. No DNA match in a database has connected him to an unknown decedent. The negative evidence, in this case, is significant. It does not prove he is alive, but it shifts the probability, however slightly, toward the possibility that he is. And yet, there have been no confirmed sightings. Not one. Not in Colorado in the weeks after his disappearance. Not in a border city. Not in Honduras. Not anywhere. A person who is alive tends, over the course of 24 years, to leave some kind of trace in the documented world. A name on a lease. A medical record. An interaction with an official system. A driver's license in another country. Some footprint. If Luis Acosta is alive in Honduras, he has left no footprint that has been connected back to his Colorado case, which is, depending on how you look at it, either deeply suspicious or entirely understandable. Here is the understandable version. Honduras does not have the same integrated database infrastructure as the United States. The mechanisms by which an American missing persons case would be connected to a Honduran resident, particularly if that resident is living under a name that differs from the one on the American file, or in a rural area with limited official documentation, are genuinely limited. International missing persons cooperation existed in 2001, but it was not robust, not systematic, and not equal. Cases involving adults who had likely left voluntarily did not generate the same level of international cooperation as abduction cases or cases with confirmed foul play. If Luis arrived in Honduras and was absorbed into a community there, living under a family name, perhaps not using the Luis Acosta identity associated with his foster care placement, the gap between his existence and his American file is not hard to understand. He could have been invisible to official systems in both countries simultaneously, not because he was hiding in any dramatic sense, simply because the documentation that connects people to databases, the kind of documentation that would allow a match to be made, may not have been generated in the forms that would be searchable across an international divide. That is the understandable version of the silence. Now here is the other version. Luis Acosta is a person who, whatever happened to him after that phone call, made a choice, or had a choice made for him, that removed him from the documented world. If the choice was his own, then the silence has a different quality. It is chosen silence. Deliberate quiet. The silence of someone who made a calculation that the world he left behind did not need to know where he went. Think about what it means to grow up as a foster child in the American system. Think about what your relationship is, by the time you are 16, to official institutions. These are institutions that removed you from a family. Institutions that moved you from placement to placement. Institutions that, despite their intentions, were not able to give you the one thing every child needs most. The certainty that someone is watching out for you specifically, reliably, without the possibility of transfer or termination or bureaucratic reassignment. By the time Luis walked out of that foster home, he had likely spent years learning, in various ways, that official institutions were not on his side in any personal sense. They were structures, systems. They processed him, not loved him. If he chose to disappear from those systems, to exist, for the first time in his documented life, outside the reach of anyone who could classify him, categorize him, place him, or remove him. That choice is heartbreaking. But it is not incomprehensible. It is the logical conclusion of a certain kind of experience. And there is a quality to the silence in his case that suggests this possibility. 24 years. No contact. No names surfacing in a database. No family member coming forward to say they've heard from him. No friend, no community member, no church, no school, no organization, no one connected to Luis Acosta's life in Aurora has, as far as the public record reflects, provided any confirmed update on his whereabouts in more than 2 decades. That is a very complete disappearance. Complete disappearances, as investigators know, are rare. They require either extraordinary circumstances, a death that was never officially documented, a life lived entirely outside formal systems, or extraordinary intention. A person who wanted to disappear that completely, who maintained that disappearance for that long, would have had to work at it, would have had to build a life that left no thread leading back to the name on the Colorado file. Is that possible? Yes, particularly if you started at 16, particularly if you moved to another country, particularly if you shed the name associated with your foster care file and lived, in every practical sense, under a different identity, not a false one in any legal sense, but simply a name tied to a community that was yours before the American system ever had a hold on you. Luis Acosta, if he is alive, would be 41 years old right now. 41 years old. That teenager who walked out of a foster home, slight, dark-haired, 105 pounds, has, if time has done what time does, become a middle-aged man. The age progression technology that NamUs and other organizations use can approximate what he might look like now. The face filled out, the jaw more defined, the boy's features settled into a man's. But we have no confirmed image to work from except the description on the missing persons file. We have no photograph that the public-facing records have made available. He could walk past you on the street, and you would not know him. He could be reading about himself, somewhere, if he has internet access and the impulse to search his own name, and feel the strange vertigo of seeing yourself through the lens of a world that has kept counting you as lost. Does he know his case is open? This question is not rhetorical. It is real, and the answer to it matters enormously. If Luis Acosta is alive and knows he is still listed as a missing person in the United States, still classified as an endangered runaway, still carrying the legal status of a child in danger, and has chosen not to contact authorities to close the case, that is one thing. That is a decision made by an adult who has weighed his options and chosen silence. Perhaps out of distrust. Perhaps out of complicated feelings about the country and the system he left behind. Perhaps simply because, from where he's standing, there is nothing to be gained and everything to be risked by opening a door that he spent his adolescence learning to close. But if Luis Acosta is alive and does not know that his name is in a database, that someone is still technically looking, that his disappearance is not something the world has simply moved past, then something else is true. Then the silence between him and this case is accidental. Then somewhere in the gap between his life and this file is a connection that has simply never been made. And if that connection could be made, if this story, told on this channel, in this way, found its way to someone who knows him, someone who can say, I know that man, I know that name, I know where he is, then the silence could end. Not dramatically, not with flashing lights and official declarations, just with a quiet answer to a question that has been open for 24 years. That is possible. It is worth saying clearly. That is genuinely possible. Social media exists now in ways it did not in 2001. Video platforms like the one you're watching on right now reach into corners of the world that official investigations in 2001 had no access to. If someone who watches this video knows Luis Acosta, knows him by that name or by another name, knows his face or the face of his family, the information they have might be the thing that closes this case. Not by bringing him back, not by any dramatic intervention, simply by confirming, he's okay, he's there, you can close the file. Or, and this is the possibility that sits underneath all the others like a stone at the bottom of a river, confirming that he isn't. We don't want that to be the answer. Nobody wants that. But someone deserves to know. There are people connected to Luis Acosta's story, maybe in Aurora, maybe in Honduras, maybe somewhere in between, who carry a piece of this. Who knows something that the official record doesn't. who have been holding that peace for 24 years in the quiet of their own lives, unsure of whether it matters or whether anyone is still asking. Someone is still asking. This channel is asking. This story is asking. And the next section is about what tools we now have to look for answers. Because the world of 2026 is very different from the world of 2001, and some of those differences might matter to this case in ways that weren't possible before. But first, we need to sit here for one more moment. A 16-year-old boy made a phone call and said 4 words. And then the world went quiet around his name. That quiet, that 24-year silence, is the heaviest thing in this case. Heavier than any theory. Heavier than any possibility. Because silence, in the context of a missing child, is never neutral. It is always something. It is either protection or grief or choice or loss. And we don't know which of those things this silence is. We only know that it has lasted long enough. It has lasted long enough. Here is where the case stands today. Luis Acosta remains listed on the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's missing persons documentation. His name appears in the CBI's official records, in the category of missing persons from Colorado who have not been located and whose cases remain active in some form. He is additionally listed on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, which is the federal database maintained through the National Institute of Justice that serves as the national centralized repository for missing person and unidentified remains cases across the United States. Both of these systems exist because of a recognition that was hard-won and long overdue. That missing persons cases, particularly those involving people who were young and vulnerable at the time of their disappearance, do not become less important with time. They become more important. Because time means that the people who knew them are aging. The memories are fading. The physical evidence, if there was ever any, is deteriorating. The window in which a case can be definitively resolved narrows with every year that passes. And yet, paradoxically, the tools available to close cold cases have expanded enormously in the years since 2001. Let's talk about what those tools mean for a case like Luis Acosta's. Genetic genealogy. In the years following the resolution of the Golden State Killer case in 2018, through the use of consumer DNA databases and genealogical research, the application of genetic genealogy to missing persons and unidentified remains cases has grown significantly. What this means, practically, is that biological relatives of a missing person who submit their DNA to consumer databases can potentially be linked to unidentified remains that no one has been able to name. If any of Luis Acosta's biological relatives, parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, have submitted DNA to a consumer genealogy database, and if his case has any unidentified remains component, that connection could theoretically be made. Age progression technology. The tools available for generating age-progressed images of missing individuals have improved dramatically since 2001. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children regularly update images for long-term missing persons cases, generating approximations of what a person might look like at their current age based on biological family members and known aging patterns. If Luis Acosta's case were to receive updated visual materials, an approximated image of what he might look like at 41, that image could be shared, could circulate, could reach eyes that know what they're looking at. International cooperation. The mechanisms for missing persons cooperation between the United States and Central American countries have improved since 2001, though they remain imperfect. Organizations dedicated to locating missing children and adults in Central America exist now that did not have the same reach or infrastructure in 2001. If Luis is indeed in Honduras, the possibility of locating him through these channels, particularly if someone with knowledge of his whereabouts provides a lead, is more real today than it has ever been. Social media and digital outreach. This is perhaps the most significant development. In 2001, the only way to circulate information about a missing person was through official bulletins, local media, and word of mouth. Today, a story shared on a video platform can reach not just Aurora, Colorado, but the communities in Honduras that the original investigation may never have been able to access. A face, a name, a story, if it reaches the right person, the right community, can generate the kind of tip that no official investigation ever could. That is what this video is, in one sense. It is an act of outreach. It is an attempt to close a gap that official channels have not been able to close on their own. And if you are watching this, wherever you are watching from, whether you're in Colorado or Honduras or somewhere in between, and you know something, there is a place to report it. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation maintains a tip line. NamUs has a contact mechanism. Local law enforcement in Aurora can receive information. Anonymous tips are accepted. The only requirement is that someone who knows something decides to say it. We want to say something directly now, and it's important. If Luis Acosta is watching this, if by some extraordinary chance this story has found its way to a 41-year-old man who remembers making a phone call when he was 16, you should know something. There is no obligation created by an open missing persons file. There is no arrest warrant. There is no court order waiting. As an adult who made the decision to leave as a minor, and who has lived his life for 24 years without engaging with this case, there is no legal consequence to your continued silence. You owe the system nothing. But the people who loved you, if they exist, if they have been wondering, they deserve to know you're okay. And the people who work on cases like yours, who believe that every missing person deserves an answer no matter how long it takes, they are not looking for you to come back. They are looking for you to be counted, to be real, to be a person whose story has a continuing chapter, not just an abrupt and permanent end. You deserve to be counted. Now let's come back to where we started. November 18th, 2001. Aurora, Colorado. A phone rings. I'm never coming back. For words. And then the line goes quiet. We have spent the last hour trying to understand those 4 words. We have looked at who Luis Acosta was, as much as the confirmed record allows us to know. We have looked at the world he was living in, the foster care system, and what it produces in the children who move through it. The night he walked away, the call he made, the Honduras theory, and the questions it raises. The 4 possibilities that sit at the center of this case. All of them real, none of them resolved. And we have arrived here, at the edge of what we can know with certainty, looking into the space where certainty gives way to the unknown. There are 2 stories this case could be, and the truth is somewhere between them. The first story, a 16-year-old boy who had spent his life being processed by institutions that could not truly see him, walked out one November night, and, in a remarkable act of will and determination, found his way to somewhere he had never been. A country, a family, a version of himself that had nothing to do with Colorado or foster care or a file with his name on it. He is 41. He is okay. He made it. The second story, a 16-year-old boy walked into a world that was not prepared to protect him, and the phone call was the last moment in which his voice was entirely his own. Whatever came after, whatever form the danger took, whatever happened in the days and weeks and months after that November night, he was not okay. He was not safe. And the world that was supposed to protect him failed him in a way that has never been formally acknowledged, never been documented, never been given the weight it deserves. The truth is somewhere between those 2 stories. It might be closer to the first. We hope it is. The evidence, such as it is, gestures tentatively in that direction. The Honduras lead is not nothing. The absence of remains is not nothing. The pattern of foster youth with family ties in Central America making their way there is documented and real. But we cannot pretend the second story doesn't exist. We cannot close the gap between those 2 possibilities by choosing the one that's more comfortable. What we can do, what we have tried to do today, is tell the truth about the case as we know it. Tell it without flinching and without false comfort. Hold the space between the 2 stories open, because that space is exactly where Luis Acosta exists in the official record, between known and unknown, between found and lost, between alive and not. His case is open. His story is unresolved. And somewhere, in Aurora, in Honduras, in a community connected to his, in a family that carries his blood, someone knows something. This is where we ask you to do something. Share this video. Not because missing persons cases go viral and that fixes things. They don't, usually. Share it because the mathematics of reach matter. Every additional person who watches this story is another person who might recognize something. A name, a face, a connection. Every share is a broader net. In this particular case, in this particular moment, might benefit from a net cast wider than Aurora, Colorado. It might need to reach Honduras. It might need to reach the Spanish-speaking communities across Colorado and the Mountain West who knew the networks, the people, the families that could have been connected to Luis's life. If you know something, if you've heard a name, seen a face, been part of a community that remembers something, contact the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Contact NamUs. If you're outside the United States, contact local authorities and ask how to report information to an American missing persons case. The mechanisms exist. They are imperfect, but they exist. And Luis Acosta's case number exists. His name is in a system that is still, after 24 years, waiting for an answer. Go ahead and like this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the cases we cover here. Drop a comment, your theories, your thoughts, anything that feels relevant. The comment section on videos like this one has, in more than one documented case, produced leads that mattered. Someone watching quietly, scrolling past, suddenly recognizing something. It happens. Let it happen here. And finally, I'm never coming back. Whatever he meant when he said it. Whatever was true about those words, and whatever was performance. Whatever came after. Luis Acosta was real. He was a 16-year-old boy. He had brown eyes and short black hair and a slim build that made him look younger than he was. He was in a foster home in Aurora, Colorado, and one November evening, he walked out and called back to say he wasn't returning. 24 years later, no one has confirmed where he went. 24 years later, a system is still carrying his name. 24 years later, the phone call echoes. And the silence on the other end of the line is the one thing in this case that has never changed. It is still there. It is still waiting. And somewhere, in a life we cannot fully see, so, perhaps, is he. If you have information about Luis Acosta, please contact the Colorado Bureau of Investigation or submit a tip through namus.gov. His case remains active,